Okay, thank you for this introduction. So today I will share with you part of my PhD work on the early detection of mental fatigue on the central autonomic networks from synchronous recording of cerebral and cardiac activity. So to start this presentation, I will briefly introduce the concept of fatigue. So fatigue is defined as a difficulty to initiate or to maintain a voluntary activity, and we have several divisions to understand this fatigue. Firstly, a division or the time division with a chronic fatigue, a fatigue trait, and secondly, the acute fatigue, a fatigue state. This is on the fatigue state where we focus on this study. A second division is the location of the structure or deteriorate by fatigue, locate in the central nervous system or locate in the peripheral nervous system. Last division is a functional division, the neuromuscular fatigue, so the fatigue from motor control to the execution of movements, and the cognitive or mental fatigue, the neural network fatigue following prolonged cognitive tasks. So this fatigue refers to cognitive processes and refers to cognition. Cognition encompasses all the human function to permit the human to adapt to his environment. We require cognitive processes in different situations in our work all day, and in the situation of aircraft pilots, he engage highly attentional processes in his activity, who can conduce to mental fatigue. This mental fatigue is defined as a neuropsychophysiological signatures associated to a state expressed as tired by the individual. And in this definition, we have this term, a state expressed tired by the individual. So, subjective fatigue, the state is expressed, and an objective fatigue linked to a degrade of performance, like response time or degrade on performance on executive function. This mental fatigue is experienced in an ecological context in whole days and impacts performance and well-being. This mental fatigue in a research protocol is tested with a prolonged cognitive test, like the 8 continuous performance tests, to induce mental fatigue with 30 minutes and sometimes several hours of cognitive tests to induce this fatigue. The mental fatigue will affect some central network, like the rewarding system, guides the behavior of the individual toward the action the more profitable, and another network, the dual control system, introduced by Ishi and colleagues in 2014, where we have in this dual control system a facilitation system who needs to maintain performance when I engage on a cognitive load on cognitive tasks, and an antagonist inhibition system who will degrade performance. And with the time engaged in the cognitive load, when we arrive in chronic, the inhibition system takes over the facilitation system and the performance degrades. This modification of central network will modify activity of central activities related to cognitive function. So modification of central activity, but we could identify this modification beyond the confines of the brain on the thought activity with work to identify interconnection between the brain, between the brain and the thoughts. So this work are, for example, the work for Bouny in 1983 on the central autonomic network, an extended network that includes central structures and peripheral autonomic structures that regulate cardiac activity, or also the work from Pierre in 2000, the neurovisceral integration model. Okay, so in this study, we want to detect the early effects of mental fatigue on cardiac activity, and with the interconnection of cardiac and autonomic via the interconnection of these two structures, to detect mental fatigue with also cardiac activity recording. this aim, we use a protocol with 3 phases: a pre-baseline, a pre-interaction baseline, secondly, a continuous vigilance task, 40 minutes of continuous vigilance task to induce mental fatigue, and a post-interaction baseline to identify effects of this continuous vigilance task. At different stages of the experiments, we observed the cognitive load with NASA-TLX, the stress and the fatigue with visual analog scales. For the task is designed in our lab and is designed to highly engage cognitive processes to fatigue the subject to induce mental fatigue. Here's the instruction of the task, where you are to find on a skyline some little boats, and if the boat is blue, you have to let pass it because it's an ally, and if the boat is red, it's an enemy, and you have to sink it with press the spacebar on the keyboard. That's an example of a little red boat that appears in the skyline. During the whole protocol, we record synchronously EEG and ECG activity with EEG headset and an ECG device. We analyze these 2 biosignals in frequential domains. For EEG biosignal, we use empirical mode decomposition, and for ECG data, we use the frequential analysis using fast Fourier transform to extract LF and HF biomarkers. For the analysis of results, I divided the 40-minute continuous task in 4 phases of 10 minutes to analyze in the task the evolution of these markers. Point of methods on the decomposition of EEG. Firstly, we used the empirical mode decomposition to decompose EEG signal into 6 intrinsic mode functions. So frequential modes present in the signal. This method is a data-driven method. And so we extract 6 IMF from the IMF1, the highest frequency ones, to IMF6, but are frequentially near to classical brain rhythm identified. For the ECG data, firstly, we observe the RR interval to extract the heart rate variability, and then we perform a fast Fourier transform to extract HF and LF biomarker as the power here in the power spectral density between the boundary of sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. For the results, firstly, I talked about the questionnaires and the NASA-TLX results on the total workload and mental workload. For the first results, we observed that the perceived total load and the perceived mental load increased during the vigilance task, and only during that task, not between the pre and the pre-interaction baseline. For the visual analog scale of fatigue and stress, we observed self-reported fatigue in significant increase after the continuous vigilance task that remains higher in the post-baseline than in the pre-baseline. For the stress, no change throughout the experiments. So we also observed the performance metrics in 2 dimensions, response time to the task and the inhibition capacities. For these 2 dimensions, along the 4th phase of 10 minutes of the task, we don't have difference, and performance remains stable in terms of response times and in terms of inhibition capacities. For the biosignal data, firstly for the EEG decomposition, we observed in this domain an increased mean IMF1, so the IMF with the highest frequency, an increased energy between the pre-baseline and the task, immediately at the beginning of the task. Secondly, we observed an increase between the pre-baseline and the post-baseline for this EMF of high frequency. And during the task, across the 4 phases in the task, we also observe an increase of this EMF. For the EMF5, an EMF of low frequency near to theta rhythm, we observe, like for the EMF1, an increase between the pre and between the task, but here, not at the beginning, but after some time passed on the task, after the 10 first minutes. For this IMF5, we observed an increase during the task across the 4 phases of the task, and we observe a decrease after the task in the post-baseline that returned close to its initial level. For HRV biomarkers, so low frequency and high frequencies related to parasympathetic and sympathetic, we observed for the Q an increase between the prey and the task immediately for HF, but with 10 minutes of latency for LF, who increase after the 10 first minutes of task. The total autonomic power, so HF and LF power, significant increase between the prey and the post baseline. Conclude 3 points. The vigilance task we used results in significant greater self-reported fatigue and perceived workload. Secondly, potential analysis of EEG biosignal show a change in brain activity over the course of the experimental protocol, with change between the baseline and between the phases of the task, but also across the phases of the task, the 4 10-minute phases. Cardiac autonomic cues, HF and LF, increase in parasympathetic activity from the first phase of the task, followed by an increase of sympathetic activity after 10 minutes. To finish, total autonomic activity is higher in the post-baseline. Just to explore some prospects, we could use multivariate analysis to identify some specific responses. Like we see on the plot, we have a high interindividual variability that can mask some specific response. So this analysis could help identify this profile. Synchronization measurements like autoregressive model will help us to identify in real time interaction between brain and cardiac signal. Finally, the use of biofeedback, neurofeedback of biofeedback or biofeedback HRV could help to prevent cognitive fatigue. And I finish